Here's a video on how to look at soil structure and determine the different grades of soil structure using VESS, the Visual Assessment of Soil Structure. And so here I have 3 different soils that I have dug up. Everything's frozen right now, so we'll use soil samples that I've previously gathered. And with this visual assessment of soils, what we're doing, we dig a hole and bring up our soils. So you want to get a spade full, use your shovel, dig down, and you want to get, at least 8 inches deep, and you want to dig your soils up. And your soils are probably going to look very different at the bottom versus the top. And you might notice differences in the middle of the soil profile as well. How the soil is managed will greatly change what you see for soil structure. And so here I have some different examples of soil structure for what you'll probably see when you dig. So this first one, it's pretty massive. And so when we look at it, we don't see a lot of small curves to it. It's kind of a straight block. If we break it apart, it's very hard to break apart. And it breaks apart into straight lines, straight faces. And as it falls apart, we're not really getting soil aggregates. These are just chunks and blocks of soil. And so we would say that this really doesn't have soil structure. It looks more massive. And so on the VESS, on that scale, we would call this a 5, where it doesn't have soil structure. It's very hard to break apart. And when it does break apart, we're not seeing soil structure. It's just flat, massive, angular, structureless soil. So then somewhere in the middle, we have this soil clod, and you can see on the surface of it, it has all these little bumps on it. It's not just straight and massive. There's some pore channels in there, some openings. And so it looks like this has some signs of soil structure. What happens when we break it apart? Oh, we're breaking apart, and as we're breaking apart, we're seeing all of this like different, we can call it relief, like if you were to see in the landscape. And also when it breaks apart into smaller pieces, we're breaking into small soil aggregates. We've got a beautiful, beautiful channel right in there from an earthworm. And we see a lot of pores and channels in here. And it's kind of lumpy, kind of going toward cottage cheese. And so when you break this apart, oh, there's some worm scat. That'll be for our next segment, our other segment for biology. But do you see how it's not that flat, sheer surface like the last one? So this one does have soil structure to it. It's not ideal, it's not perfect, but we would rate this, we'd be looking at a 2 going to a 3 on the VESS scale. When the soils are moist, they're a little bit easier to see as well. So here, our first soil, that was a 5. That's the lowest on the VESS scale. This one is a 2 parting to a 3, so we're improving greatly. And now here's a soil, another soil, where you can just see on the surface all those mounds, all those soil aggregates. We have great roots coming in everywhere. This doesn't look straight or blocky at all. And so let's break this apart. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's beautiful. All right, so we break this apart, and we see some of the soil falling from it, but that's okay because we're keeping great structure. So these are micro aggregates, and they're holding together really nicely, not in a blocky way, not in a straight face way. We have all of this. Now this is truly, the cottage cheese soil structure that we're looking for. It is fantastic. There's room for air, roots, and soil organisms to be in there. And as we keep breaking it, the only thing holding it together are the roots. Oh, beautiful root. You know, we see all this strong soil structure all over this. And so we would rate this as a 1. So this is the best soil structure rating that you can get in using your VESS. So what we want to look for is all these soil aggregates, and when you break it apart, you know, we continue to have soil aggregates. We don't have those straight faces like we did, you know, with this soil where, you know, looks kind of like a moon rock. There's really nothing going on there. And when it crumbles into like single grain soils. There's no little aggregates holding it together. It just breaks apart into the straight faces, different than this one that continues to have soil structure. And so that is how you analyze the soil to determine your VESS rating for your soil structure. So how do we improve our soil structure, and why is it important? Well, the importance of good soil structure is for our crops, our soil organisms, and for water to infiltrate. And so if we have poor soil structure where our soils are massive, we don't have any pores or root channels, it's going to be very hard for that water to infiltrate. Also, if a root tries to grow through this, there's no cracks, there's no pores, there's no channels for it. It's going to have a hard time penetrating and taking a lot of energy to just break through the soil to grow and to find more water and nutrients in the soil and air. So when we have a soil with poor structure, it makes our crops work harder. It reduces the ability for the water to infiltrate, and we're going to be lacking oxygen in the soil, stressing our plants further. And so as we are improving our soil structure, it's going to be easier for the roots to break through. There'll be areas for air and water to get through, and the plants won't be so stressed and won't have to work so hard. And as we continue to improve it, our soils are back to what they should be, about 45% mineral, so 45% sand, silt, clay, about 5% organic matter, and about 45 to 50% air and water space. So really half of your soils, that's just for air and water. And so you can also notice with the same size clod, your compacted soils will be heavier than your non-compacted soils because there's all this pore space in here allowing air and water to move about. And also this really helps, when you can see all these roots on here, it really helps the roots be able to find their ways through, to be able to get air, water, and nutrients. And it stresses our plants less because they don't have to work so hard to be able to break through all of this. Because with that soil structure, there's all these areas in between that the roots can go. And so how do we improve our soil structure? Well, every time we disturb the soil, so anytime that we utilize tillage or even plant, even driving on soils, especially when they're wet, it breaks the soil structure. And as we break the soil structure, it breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And if we keep breaking it down, you know, we're going to get that single grain soil. And what happens when we have that single grain soil is that can move around so easily with wind and water. And also when we have the soil broken down, it'll find all these cracks and pore channels in the soil, and it'll fill them in, and then it effectively seals the soil off so that when water falls, you know, precipitation or irrigation, it seals it off so it doesn't allow that water to infiltrate. And so reducing the disturbance in the soil, one less tillage pass, going to strip till, going to no-till, you know, anytime that we can reduce the amount of disturbance that we have on our soils, it allows the soil a time to build again. You know, the organisms in the soil, it's kind of like our communities. We ask kids, you know, what would happen if a tornado were to come through your town this year? They said, oh, well, you know, we'd rebuild and we'd move on. Okay, well, what if a tornado came through your town, you know, maybe like 3 times a year? Well, the kids said, well, we would move. Why would we stay there? And that's exactly what's happening with these soil organisms. They have communities under the soil. And when the soil is continually disturbed and tilled, what happens is these soil organisms, they die, they don't flourish. They spend all their time just trying to rebuild and have food and be safe. And in the soils where we're limiting disturbance or reducing it, you know, to the very minimum of planting and applying our fertilizers and pesticides, these soil organisms, they're not constantly trying to rebuild their homes. They're not trying to, you know, stay safe against all that. They have the time, the energy, and the resources to build that soil structure. And the neat thing with that, the soil organisms actually help feed our plants and our row crops. And so reducing the amount of disturbance we have out on the soil improves the soil organisms to be able to make the soils have great soil structure. You know, it's not giving them such a hard time. If you give kids a test every day, they're not going to do very well in learning. They're going to be stressed out all the time. You know, but if we have our tests, you know, scattered here and there, they're going to have time to learn in between. So it's the same thing with the soils. And also when we drive on wet soils, that compacts the soils. We're squishing out all the pore space, because when soils are wet and saturated, they lose their strength. There's something called the slake test that you can watch to see how soils react as they get saturated. So when your soils are wet and saturated, they don't have as much strength as when they're dry. So when we drive out on those wet soils, we're just compacting, we're just squishing all that pore space out. So we want to avoid traffic on wet soils. Another great option to improve soil structure is to utilize cover crops. And with cover crops, you know, with our row crops, we have them in our rows. And so there's a lot of area in between the rows where roots aren't growing and there's no protection of the soil surface. With cover crops, we can broadcast them out on the field, and so they cover every square inch. And then we have roots growing down all over the field instead of just in our rows. And those roots, they'll break up the compaction, they'll create these pore channels, all these spaces to let that water infiltrate, to increase the amount of air that's available in the soil, add organic matter, and also they'll help to feed the soil organisms, which in turn make nutrients plant available and help to build this soil structure. Also integrating small grains into the rotation. You know, it's nice because you have them covering a large majority of the soil surface. Again, it's not in these wide rows, so we have roots growing everywhere. Another option too is to add diversity, and that's a great way to do that is with cover crops, because in 1 tablespoon of soil, there's more living organisms in that tablespoon of soil than there are people on the entire earth. And so we want to be able to utilize them. And when we have plants growing, they exude sugars in the soil. Well, why would plants use their energy and resources to pump out sugar in the soil? Well, because over thousands of years, they've created a partnership with the soil organisms. And so the plants pump out the sugars, essentially ringing the dinner bell saying, I'm here, come get me. And then the soil organisms, they see it's a huge buffet line. And so they gobble up those sugars and carbohydrates that the soils exude. And in turn, the soil organisms, they die, they eat each other, they defecate. And as these soil organisms are doing these processes, they are making nutrients plant available. And so that's why the plants want these soil organisms around their roots, so that these soil organisms come in, essentially convert nutrients into plant available nutrients right next to that plant's root. And so then it gets this payback by getting its, it's getting its multivitamin from the soil organisms, as well as the soil organisms, creating organic matter from breaking down of residue, building the soil structure to allow, better nutrient exchange, better water infiltration, and air availability. So improving our soil structure, reduce disturbance, utilize cover crops. We want to protect the soil surface with either a living or dead plant. And then also the roots of the cover crops underneath will break up that compaction and help to build the soil structure, keeping off of soils when they're wet, and going out and paying attention to see, what does your soil look like? What is the management that I'm doing? What could I do within my management to help increase that soil structure to make my plants work less? And there's your overview.